Hi, everybody. And there has been a change. So we have DKG here instead of Avri.
I'm not Avri.
Yes. And so I'm Mallory Nodal. I work for Article 19, and I work in IETF and ICANN. And we're actually going to do a bit more. There's no real moderation, so we're just going to be asking each other some questions that hopefully will inspire you to ask us as well. And the reason why we came up with this panel is that all of us work in standard setting bodies, and but we are also affiliated with civil society organizations, which is maybe different than engineers working for companies, or it creates a different dynamic, and I think we're there for different reasons. So you'll get, I think, a different take on what's happening in these different places. So that's the idea. And this work, at least for Article 19, was sparked in around 2011, 2012, and then actually turned into a program of Article 19, which is a human rights free expression NGO in England. And because Avri, who was going to be on the panel, wrote a paper with another of my colleagues. At the time, I was working with Avri and Joy Liddicoat at the Association for Progressive Communications. They wrote this paper on the alignment or the similarities between multi-stakeholder internet governance and the technical community and the human rights kinds of advocacy that is done in general internet governance, but is also applicable and interesting to do in the technical community standard setting, because that was at the time not clear to people that it would actually be a worthwhile venture to do that. And so that was back in 2011. And what came out of that was people, well, the paper, you can go and find it. It's about human rights considerations in internet protocols, and it basically looked at the early RFCs coming out of the IETF, and how the values expressed in those early RFCs of an open, interoperable internet and so on mapped really quite nicely with some of the work human rights organizations were trying to achieve in getting a more open and free internet for all. So with that, I actually want to shift to talking specifically about the IETF. I want to ask Daniel, DKG. So some people argue the IETF is a really great, and this is why that paper came out, was the IETF is a really great example of how an open standard setting body could facilitate discussion about human rights at the technical level. So do you feel like that is an accurate characterization of the IETF, that it's open?
Thanks. So so folks know who I am, I'm Daniel Kahn-Gilmore. I'm not Avri. People call me DKG online, which is just my handle, which is my initials. I work for the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, as a technologist focused on speech, privacy, technology, and sort of the intersection of civil rights and civil liberties in tech. And so I've been at the IETF for a while. I've participated well before I started at the ACLU. And so in some sense, the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, which is the folks who make the RFC series. So if you ever hear people talking about RFCs for software implementation, that comes out of the IETF. You can participate just by joining a mailing list. So in that sense, it's very open. It really does accommodate people who want to just swoop in, read a little bit, contribute. You can write a document. Anybody here, if they want to, can actually post an internet draft, which could lead potentially eventually to an RFC today, right now, if you wanted to. So in that sense, it's very open. On the other hand, the discussions are fairly technical, and it requires some level of technical understanding for people to take you seriously there. And it requires some level of persistence and perseverance. You have to have the time to be able to negotiate among all the different stakeholders and even understand who they all are and what their interests are. So while just participating is very open, actually doing effective work there is not necessarily, because of the level of sustained engagement that's required. And then on top of that, like many tech spaces, it's an overwhelmingly male space. It's an overwhelmingly white space. It's overwhelmingly the global north. It has a bit of an old boys club, which is slowly shifting. I would love to see it shift faster. But a lot of the decisions will get made. People will make agreements based on, oh, well, that's so-and-so. I've been talking to them for 20 years, right? And so the sooner we can make the changes to really get more perspectives in the IETF, the better, so that old boys club doesn't have the decision-making power. So it's open. You don't have to pay membership to join, but you have to attend. If you really want to get things done, it's useful to attend the conferences, which can be expensive, and you have to persist, which takes time, and not everybody has the time to do it.
For sure. You want to ask me later?
Yeah. So one of the things that's happened at the that I noticed at the IETF is how long it, like the persistence problem. And so I know that for me, you know, going from submitting a proposed standard to actually getting it into a draft takes multiple years. Amelia, I think you're active within the IEEE, and my understanding is it might take even longer for standards to come out of the IEEE. Can you talk about the cadence of the process and how it affects your work?
Yeah, so my name is Amelia Andersdotter. I work for Article 19, covering the IEEE 802 Landman Standards Committee. They make the Ethernet standard and architectures of network standards, as well as the standard that is underlying Wi-Fi networks. It isn't the Wi-Fi standard, but it is the standards for the technology that underlies Wi-Fi networks that are used all over the world. And so it's a fairly mature technology. It was developed in the 1990s, and all the way up to 2010, they had some really revolutionary changes that improved the quality of Wi-Fi networks a lot. I think now that it's maturing, they're looking into, so first of all, they're aware that they take a lot of time in making the standards, and because they see themselves as competitors with cellular networks and now the 3GPP and 5G standards, they're a bit stressed out also about how long it's taking them to complete standards. But because they're a very mature standard, any changes to the underlying kind of physical way in which you make wireless communication chips is going to be a lot of tough negotiations between the essentially very few global actors that are designing and producing these chips. But what I found in terms of strategy of engagement with them is that the IEEE 802, like many other standards bodies, have a large technical debt with respect to privacy and security. And so actually those are areas where you can have more speedy advancement of amendments or processes or getting them to reflect upon or develop new strategies for dealing with these topics in a quicker way. So also because there's such an avalanche now of security and privacy laws from all over the world. I know that Alex Muntz was talking about this yesterday. So I believe that there's a possibility, at least at the IEEE, to get a slightly more speedy process, maybe even IETF level speediness when it comes to those particular topics. But when it comes, of course, to changing, you know, energy efficiency, throughput of these chips, that's just going to take them a bit of time. Also, you have to acknowledge, because the 802.11 group, which does the technical infrastructure underlying Wi-Fi networks, that basically requires them to reset their manufacturing procedures, build new fabs, basically. So that's just going to take a lot of time, and it's a really heavy investment for these companies to do, and you have to be cognizant of those kind of structural limits to the speeds that they can actually have in their standards processes.
Right. With most IETF stuff, it's software, and you can just roll out a new version of software if you have an update cycle.
Yeah, sure. That's the same thing at the IEEE. Yeah. So they have the physical level, which is really difficult for them to change. And then there's the MAC level, where all of the identifiers are and where you actually need protocols to be able to have the devices interact. And at the MAC level, you can have more speedy changes, and I think the IEEE is certainly making efforts into seeing how they can be more quick. That said, quickness can also be a bad thing, because if somebody is rushing through things, especially if they're large companies that are meeting not only in the IEEE 802, but in a bunch of different venues, it means they can concoct ideas in a different forum from the one where you're at, and it makes it more difficult for you to oversee it. So I appreciate the institutional inertia as well, because it's there to make things more foreseeable for the big companies, of course, but it also helps out when you're a civil society organization. Yeah, so speaking of slow organizations that may be moving even more glacially, Mevish, you're at the International Telecommunications Union, which is a United Nations body there for a long time. So, and it has nation states as the most powerful members. So what are the unique challenges that follow from that structure, and how do you approach the ITU?
Yeah, so first, just to introduce myself, my name is Mevish. I also work at Article 19 with Mallory and Amelia. And as Amelia has just suggested, my work mainly focuses on ITU technical standard setting, so work that happens within the ITU-T. And the work there really, where we focus is mostly in study group 20, which is looking at IoT and smart cities. And in study group 17, which is looking at technical standards related to security. As Amelia mentioned, the ITU is not a technical community in the same way that the IETF is or the IEEE. It's a UN specialized agency. It's in fact the oldest UN agency. It used to be the International Telegraph Union, and then it reformed into the International Telecommunication Union. In the last couple of decades, it's expanded its traditional mandate on telephony to include internet-related standards development, and that kind of mandate expansion has had some serious implications for human rights due to the particularities of its structure. And I think membership is an important factor of that. As Amelia mentioned, it is governmental. Governments or member states are the most powerful actors within the ITU. And I think the fundamental result of that is that the ITU is an incredibly weak standards environment. And I think there are three dynamics that really explain that phenomenon quite well. The first one is there's a systemic lack of technical competency within the ITU. I think the ITU recognizes this, and that's why it bills itself as a public-private partnership. It really puts in a lot of time and resources to bring in industry, to bring in big vendors, to help participate in its standards development processes, to give it more legitimacy as a technical authority. But even then, it's still primarily an intergovernmental body. The people who represent governments, some of them might be from national telecommunications regulatory authorities, but for the most part, they are diplomats. They're foreign policy wonks that might have some kind of training in international communications or ICTs, but that kind of technical competency just isn't there. The second dynamic within the ITU really is a lack of accountability, and that leads to politicization. And that phenomenon really has to do with the particular membership structure of the ITU itself. On the one hand, membership at the ITU is incredibly closed. Like I said, it's mostly just kind of focused on getting government membership. To a far lesser extent, industry. Industry can participate as members in the ITU, but they do not have the same level of voting rights or privileges that governments do, quite clearly so and deliberately so. And you can just forget about it if you're civil society in terms of trying to participate meaningfully in ITU standards processes. You will not be able to get membership on your own title. The ITU does not want you there. They make it very clear because you make government's job quite difficult in trying to do the work they want to do. And at the same time, of course, it's incredibly opaque. And the opacity of that decision-making process means that there isn't enough transparency for external scrutiny. So even if you can't get involved in decision-making processes within the ITU, you can't even keep track of what's happening to see what's in the pipeline. And really, because of that, it's a perfect ground for governments to, one, engage in geopolitics, and two, to kind of advance standards agendas that are actually quite repressive, that would kind of be met with staunch scrutiny elsewhere in other technical communities. And then the third dynamic is really that fundamentally the ITU is a diplomatic institution, and so even if it's similar to the IETF in terms of its core, the primacy of consensus-based decision making, it has a very different outlook from the IETF in terms of what a good outcome looks like, and that's really because it's diplomats who are doing the decision making, and diplomats are kind of trained. The one thing they're trained in is compromise, and so for them, a good text is really one that has a lot of compromise language that everyone can agree with a little bit. And I think with technical communities, kind of bad standard is just a bad standard, right? In technical parlance, so we just don't have that same kind of, the level of kind of the desire to have the same kind of technical rigor standards within the ITU.
But so, Mavish, it strikes me when you're talking that at the IETF and at the IEEE, as far I've understood Daniel and also my experience, it's very clear who is who are the technical standards for. So the IETF has all of the vendors that are meant to eventually implement these standards, the research communities that make work with the standards afterwards. At the IEEE 802 group, that is also definitely the case, that the companies that apply the standards, that change their manufacturing equipment, they're the ones that are also participating in that process. But if the ITU has a very weak standards process and they lack the technical qualifications for really writing the standards in a good way, who are the consumers of these standards? Like where does all of the work that you're doing eventually end up?
I think in terms of the ITU, the standards are really there to facilitate government agendas in terms of what their ICT policies are. And in that sense, it kind of speaks to, again, going back to those kind of three dynamics, it's the particularities of those dynamics that really allow for governments to kind of advance agendas that they wouldn't otherwise be able to in other technical spaces, right? Particularly ones that might enable greater centralization or might enable censorship or surveillance. I think in the IETF and even to an increasing extent within the IEEE, there's increasing understanding of security and privacy considerations. And that's really due to having stakeholder input and having a more diverse kind of spectrum of membership and interests with participating within those standards bodies, and that just isn't present within the ITU. So actually, as part of that, I wanted to turn that same question over to you in a way, because unlike the ITU, the IEEE is a membership organization that is dominated by industry, even though, of course, industry and governments tend to work hand in hand. I want to know from you how you navigate that environment, especially considering the fact that you're from neither stakeholder group.
Yeah, well, the IEEE is an individual membership organization, much like the IETF. So you're meant to show up in your individual capacity. Every member has a duty, according to the Code of Ethics, to act according to their best engineering assessment of any particular standard. And so in that sense, you're kind of formally supposed not to enter into the IEEE as a representative of your company. And that makes it again a bit different from, say, the 3GPP, where actually you would go representing your company. There's a corporate delegation from your company and you go to represent it. At the IEEE, this is not the case. That doesn't mean that we don't have governments showing up. But in particular, I've noticed the US government showing up. So there's a few people from the Department of Transport that are very interested in ensuring that the IEEE doesn't change any of its standards that they're trying to use for harmonizing, self-driving cars or just in general car networks. And so they're very lovely people. Then there's a few people that come from various forms of consultancies where you can have, where there's rumors about who might be paying their consultancy to show up at the meetings. But you can basically only get information about that as gossip. And they have rules at the IEEE that you need to disclose your affiliation. So I need to always have on my badge that I'm from Article 19. And other people also need to state who are sponsoring them to participate. And I think that was motivated by some antitrust problems that they had a few years ago where basically some larger actors in the field were accused of sending a lot of delegates kind of anonymously to the forum, which really thwarted the competitive field in the silicon market in that corporate actors' favor. So affiliation is always stated, and this is like the first thing that you do in order to map out the corporate dynamics of the space. Then you can rely on gossip to figure out if governments are trying to do shady interventions. And then there's a few people that are also just completely open about, hi, we're kind of covering this interest because it's just genuinely in our interest that these technical people don't get any funny ideas that will then thwart our 10, 20-year plan for how to make society a dreary place to live in.
I can give an example of something like that happened at the IETF recently, and probably will still continue to happen if folks are interested, is that the transport layer security working group at the IETF. TLS is the thing that gives you the security in HTTPS, among other things. We've just announced TLS 1.3. Hopefully it will be officially standardized relatively soon. It's in the last stage of the document preparation process. And one of the things that it does is it removes, it basically forces all of the new version of TLS to negotiate a security connection with slightly better properties than the old versions would allow. So in particular, we are mandating forward secrecy. I won't get into what forward secrecy is, but it's better to have it than to not have it. And TLS 1.3, the new version, requires it. And a group of US banks, and I'm going to mangle the name of the consortium that they appeared under, basically said, give us back the non-forward secure connections, because the vulnerabilities with non-forward security, we were actually using those to be able to debug our networks. We were collecting traffic and decrypting it all, and like, if you take this away from us, then your grandmother won't be able to make a bank transaction because we won't be able to debug our networks. Our networks are very complicated. Which, I wouldn't, it's embarrassing always to stand up and say I've made an engineering mistake. But they were willing to do that for some reason, and then they actually packed the room. So in terms of like representation, I've never seen so many bankers come to an IETF meeting before, but they all came to try to push through mechanisms to reverse this forward security decision. And so that does happen, which means, this is a situation where I think the folks who care about security and privacy and autonomy need to have sort of a constant vigilance. So I'm certainly grateful to have people, at all these standards bodies. Just to name a few that aren't being represented here, there's the W3C. Amelia, you'd mentioned 3GPP. There's GSMA, which is mobile telephony. There's a bunch of other groups that are out there that we do want more people who care about the things that I think HOPE cares about generally to be at these places.
Right. So switching over back to privacy and security, I wanted to get Mallory back in the conversation with some comments about the ICANN. So the European Data Protection Board has been complaining about WHOIS for about 15 years. Can you talk a bit, so there's been a lot of controversy, and someone in the audience might have heard about it this spring. Could you talk a bit about what is happening? Is ICANN fixing the WHOIS problem? What is the WHOIS, maybe also? And how do you see that playing out in the upcoming 6 to 12 months, let's say?
Yeah, so ICANN's a bit of an outlier. They're all unique, right? But ICANN's just policy, really. It's not a technical standard setting, but it's an important place to work in because these policies are really important for privacy and security, as you're alluding to. And also, ICANN is it's multi-stakeholder, right? You have a lot more civil society organizations involved in ICANN than these other places. Maybe it's because of the technical or the non-technical nature of ICANN, but I think there's other things at play, like there's the non-commercial user constituency. Like there are all kinds of mechanisms as well to include not just an industry and government. So ICANN is interesting, but it has its flaws. For example, like not effectively being able to deal with the privacy issues around WHOIS, which is the database of people who have bought domains and their information, and some of it is personally identifiable information. Sometimes it's not always clear what kind of information you're giving or how it's presented to non-technical people, because it's actually just a transaction. You just buy a domain. It doesn't require any technical knowledge, so people may not for the last many decades have understood what they're doing when they give over their information and what WHOIS. So it's a queryable database of all of this stuff. So it has always been identified as a privacy problem, in fact, by like high level, nation, country, in particular the EU has like, a board as part of the EU has identified this. So, and for sure, there's also been in the past California law, which I think ICANN is incorporated in California, which would have had a direct impact on something like WHOIS. So it's not for lack of trying. That from a like national policy perspective, it's really a failure, I think, at the ICANN level, and not really prioritizing it. It's clear now that with the GDPR, because can actually be held accountable to these privacy violations, that something's had to change. So the reason why it's been in the news lately is that ICANN is actually having to deal with this issue. They have some mechanisms now around making a decision. There's a temporary policy in place that expires in May, which just says we're removing the personally identifiable information from Whois, and you can't get it now unless you put in a special request. Putting in a special request, there's actually no clear standard around how that's done. So, you know, if you're doing research, one of the big arguments, even from the non-commercial users constituency, was academics like Whois, because they can use it for research. And so taking Whois completely away would be a problem for them. So I guess if you're on that level, you could put in a special request so you can get all the Whois data for what you're looking for, including the PII. But yeah, there's not, the policy they have does not actually standardize the mechanism for how to do that consistently. Again, that expires in May, and hopefully by May, there will be an actual decision around what to do with Whois. So that's still in process. I can. So yeah, I guess I've already gone over the current state. So Mevish, I wanted to go back to ITU because there's some really interesting, maybe a stronger word would be terrifying stuff that's being talked about at the ITU. Can you give an example of, can you talk about the example of digital object architecture, DOA?
Yeah. Sure. So DOA is an architecture that, I mean, it's used as it calls itself a distributed information storage, location and retrieval system, and it's deployed over the internet. And I think its most widespread implementation has really been used in library systems. It's been floating around in other technical communities and policy spaces within the internet governance landscape for a while. The IETF was talking about it a little bit. It keeps coming up in ICANN, but DOA has taken the ITU by storm. And it's most recently come up in proposals for IoT identifier systems, particularly within Study Group 20 on IoT and smart cities. And you know, this would be a system where IoT devices, information would be ascribed an identifier, and you know, you would be able to use the system to resolve that identifier into the location of whatever is being identified. But there are two particular problems with DOA that we've seen based on the current implementations that it has. The first is that the actual identifier is managed by one particular organization. It's called the DONA Foundation. And not only is this organization, not only does it have like sole responsibility and kind of control over the identifier that's being used in this kind of architectural system or architectural framework, but it also determines the other organizations that get to participate in the distributed management of the identifier registry. So this one organization kind of has all the cards in this particular scheme. And the other kind of concern here is that the identifier is really pitched as being persistent. And this kind of flies in the face of the kind of privacy work that's being done even at the MAC level, and what Amelia is talking about with MAC randomization, and even in terms of IPv6 and IP addressing. But this is really kind of championed as this like static identifier that's just fixed for whatever it is being identified. And so there are two kind of key problems from a human rights perspective. I mean, first is the transparency and accountability problem of not being able to have an open or inclusive governance model for this kind of identifier system, particularly when it comes to IoT, which you know has huge ramifications for privacy, and then you know as a secondary impact to freedom of expression. But then also kind of the potential for surveillance in terms of location tracking or even activity monitoring by having a persistent unique identifier kind of for all of our IoT devices, and even kind of the sub-technologies, multiple sub-technologies that make up a single IoT device, all of the sensors that go into a single device. And so that's quite problematic. It's getting a lot of traction in the ITU, but in the IETF, it's already kind of been debunked. There's one kind of non-normative memo flying around kind of like in isolation. It was very clear that it's not a standard within the IETF. In ICANN, kind of the DONA Foundation has put together quite a lot of presentations, but to no real traction. And I think this is kind of, this DOA as an example really speaks to how standards development exists as an ecosystem, right? And I think that's really what we're all getting at here, is that it's not about one particular technical community or intergovernmental forum or one particular standard setting space. It's about the entire landscape and looking at it as an environment where if you have a very weak environment like the ITU, it has reverberations because problematic proposals that crop up in a particular forum where the decision-making processes are strong enough to kick it out on technical grounds or otherwise, they will crop up because forum shopping does happen in this space, and the proponents of those proposals will take advantage of weaker spaces where you have technical competency issues. Where I think, as Amelia was saying, it's sometimes the inertia is actually a good thing. In my opinion, it definitely is, because the more technical competency you have in a space, it allows for greater scrutiny. And if you don't have that competency, then standards just kind of, there's no friction, and proposals just kind of fly through, and you can push standards through fairly quickly. The transparency problem, the accountability problem, right? These are all big issues. And I mean, the ITU, particularly as a diplomatic institution, it's different, where if you have a bad proposal on the table, even if you're a government actor that recognizes that it's a bad proposal, diplomacy kind of ties your hands, because in a geopolitical space, you don't really have the capacity to say to another member state's administration that your proposal is really awful and we hate it and we're going to stop it completely. That would be a diplomatic nightmare. And so bad proposals just kind of linger on in the ITU. DOA is a great example of that.
So if I can just break in on that, I think one of the things that you said really resonated with me, which is that we need to look at these things as a landscape as well, right? Yeah. It isn't about a single proposal that is good or bad. It's actually about the way that these things interact, particularly when we're talking about things like surveillance and privacy. The technical decisions and details that need to be made across a range of systems to make them work. So, you talk about DOAs and location-based identifiers. We're having these discussions in the IETF as well. And one of the things that I've observed as I've been looking at them is that you actually have to, if you really want to be able to have anonymity or privacy, you need to make sure that the systems that you're building are integrated across the entire stack, right? We have an anonymity profile for DHCP so that you don't leak a persistent identifier to the DHCP server that grants you network configuration. But if you use that without randomizing the MAC address at the IEEE layer, then you're still linkable. And then if you do those two things successfully, but then you're publishing a DOA somewhere else, then you've given yourself another set of linkability, or linkability, right? So all of these things actually need to be coordinated together, and being aware of that big picture and how they interact is really pretty critical. We regularly get proposals that try to introduce some sort of linkability back in. I was just at the IETF in Montreal yesterday, where someone was proposing trying to encourage people to log more information when they do carrier-grade NAT, which is where you have one network address that you provide for 1,000 people, and they want to log the source port for outbound connections from carrier-grade NAT to facilitate law enforcement investigation. And people are getting clever about how they present this. They're like, well, here's a really bad thing we could do. We could ask you to log all traffic, period. The other endpoint of the traffic, the duration, the net flow information, all of that. So we don't really want to do that because that has privacy concerns. But what we're currently doing, nobody seems to log the source ports. So then when you find out that something's gone wrong, you can't trace it back to an individual, and that doesn't work either. So let's find a middle ground, right? That's the sort of framing that people tend to come in with this stuff. And so but once you start logging that information and other people are logging incoming port information, then you can fit that back together if you have access to the centralized logs through something like CISA, like the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act, which works at a totally political layer. then you can stitch those things back together to form a surveillance network that you wouldn't otherwise be able to build. So really thinking about it at all the layers is important if we want to advance these policies.
But can I intervene there? So I think that particular logging proposal that you're talking about is not likely to make it anywhere, because at least hypothetically, it should be kind of illegal in the European Union. So there's some
Source port logging would be illegal?
well, just data retention at the carrier grade NAT level should be illegal after December 2016, although it depends a bit on how much the European level is able to impose itself on the member state level. But I was following that proposal because it's such a challenge in the European Union right now to keep member states, so the kind of nation state level, in check with respect to the human rights standards that are set by the European Union level. And a lot of member nation states that are members of the EU are rebelling against the really quite high standards advanced from Brussels. But so normally I would assume that this proposal wouldn't make it anywhere at the IETF at this time.
Well, it's not making it anywhere right now at the IETF, which has been nice. The pushback within the IETF has basically said, if we're going to promulgate any sort of expectations about logging, then